All right, so this is Clothing Brands Need to Step Up and Keep Women Safe in Their Factories by Aruna Kashyia. So, in a recent survey of experts, countries were ranked according to how safe they are for women. India came out as the most dangerous, followed by Afghanistan and Syria. Leaving aside the survey's obvious challenges, including its attempt to use 6 measures to compare 10 very different countries, it paints a dire picture for women's safety in the world. One area in which women everywhere face discrimination, inequality, harassment, or violence in their everyday lives is in their workplace. Government and corporations must contend with how to keep women safe when they are working. So let's go ahead and just real quick note right here this thesis here, okay? This idea that this is kind of the working thing we're working, the kind of working main idea that we're trying to get to, right? I think a couple other things that we need to think about here. So we're going to look at this through the feminist lens. Obviously, the subject of this is women, and we have the fact that this was a female author. Okay, so I think those are some things to kind of keep in mind. Obviously, I think because we're talking about factories, we're talking about workplaces, I do believe that there is also the Marxist lens, right, or that economic lens as well. Something to kind of think about here is, I love this comment here, leaving aside the survey's obvious challenges, right? And my question would be is like, what are those challenges, right? Like you say they're obvious, but what are those obvious challenges? They make it sound like we would already know that, right? That we should just jump right in there and be, yeah, okay, yeah, I got it, right? Paragraph 2. Globally, women's rights movements have forced many companies to revisit their gender pay gap and anti-harassment policies. The momentum has spurred discussions for a new international labor standard that squarely addresses violence and harassment in the workplace. So that there is, we see movement, right? We have seen success, okay? And I think it's interesting to note that she makes this comment early on that they have seen success. Let's look at paragraph 3. As in the apparel industry, for example, where women make up much of the global workforce, apparel companies should do more to create workspaces free of violence and harassment. This is not just for the benefit of their own employees, but also for their customers and clients walking into their stores, the models who are the faces of their clothes, and the workers producing their clothes and shoes in factories around the world. So again, we have that feminist lens, we have that Marxist lens there, right? Okay. I think also, too, we talked about in some of our previous articles about how much of the workforce in these factories is female, right? And that is just, again, plays up that part. And then here, this idea of violence and harassment, this is probably a question that we would need to kind of clarify, or we might want to ask about. Like, what do you mean by violence? What do we mean by harassment? The obvious is sexual harassment, right? Is that sexual violence? Is that physical violence? Is that, physical? Is that mental abuse? So what kinds of issues are we talking about? Okay. Now, again, we do want to take, we talked about looking at the picture and trying to see certain things in the pictures, right? So we see, the factory floor. We see all the people working in here. We also see the clothing that they're wearing, so we get a sense of where this is at, right? So we want to ask those critical questions of the picture, which are supposed to be adding into the meaning of the article. Paragraph 4. In May, when I was speaking to garment workers about the conditions in factory, I met Roja R., a married woman in her 30s who worked in a factory in an Indian city of Mysore, making clothing for international brands. She told me the cutting section supervisor had been stalking her. She said he misused his access to her cell phone number, calling her after work hours to harass her. He promised that if she submitted to his demands, he would give her a more manageable workload and assured her that he would quickly approve requests for time off. Rosa resisted. She complained to the factory administration, but the person she spoke with laughed and told her this is normal practice and you will need to adjust. Nobody in the factory's management took the steps that Indian law requires to stop harassment. That includes setting up an internal complaints committee and disseminating and publicly displaying the names and contact information of committee members. Companies are also supposed to develop a policy against harassment and widely publicize it through harassment prevention training programs. The harassment went on for months, Rosa said. She was losing sleep. Coming from a conservative family, she worried that her husband would find out, blame her, and stop her from going to work. By the time I had met her, the problem hadn't been resolved. Another of her coworkers also told me she was harassed in a different part of the same factory. So we're going to come over here and we're going to talk about this, the person speaking, right? So we have an author, but then she brings in another voice, and that's Rosa, okay? Now, why would she bring in this person? Why would she, instead of saying, oh, here, I talked to this woman, a lot of people in the factory, they complained about this. I talked to one woman and she verified it. Notice this is a personal story, right? And the idea here is that by bringing in a first-person account, right, the first-person account of what's going on here, we get to feel what's going on. We get an expert or an inside view, right? We get to see it in a little different way. So the author of this text, she could be talking about all these things and giving all this information, but she has a person who's telling that story from the inside, right? So I'm on the outside and I'm telling this story about something I heard, or, hey, here's a person who is on the inside who has first-person knowledge. It gives it a different sense, right? It gives it a different feel, okay? And it allows us to see it in the eyes of the person who actually is dealing with this. Paragraph 7. Even in their desperation for some respite from the harassment, they had one plea. They wanted the clothing brands they worked for to help fix the problem, but not by cutting ties with the factory. If the factory lost business, these women could lose their jobs. They feared not just for their own livelihoods, but also those of their colleagues. So they kind of felt trapped, right? They kind of felt trapped in a way for a couple of different reasons. One was, like Rosa came from a very conservative family. They were very worried about how their husband would take that. They might be blamed for the harassment. They might not be allowed to go to work or something, and so they lose that independence. They lose that money. But also, too, they were worried about, like, okay, so the factory loses this work, and they can't hire these women to do the work anymore. The factory's management exploited this fear. The women say supervisors had threatened them, telling them that any mention of harassment or other complaints to the monitors who inspected factories for labor compliance would cause problems. These women were told, you will take away food from many mouths. Do you want to eat mud? All right. Think of this shame, right? Think of this idea of shame. Think of this idea of extortion, right? Like they were putting it on these women. Do this or other people will suffer, right? Number 9, brands need to be held accountable for monitoring and remediating labor conditions in the factory they source from, rather than being allowed to conveniently distance themselves from labor abuses. So here they're just saying the brands have to be actively involved. They can't just say, oh, well, we hired somebody and they have to handle their own thing, right? Like they're saying, no, you have to be in part of it. Paragraph 10. No doubt a brand should be able to cut ties with a factory that is a repeat offender, one that shows zero willingness to put in place legal protections and to abide by international human rights standards. But before taking that step, companies need to find ways to help factories improve and ensure that workers can safely raise their issues. So notice the word choice here, right? Remember the word that we've been talking about, diction, okay? That we have very specific word choice, okay? Notice here, zero willingness, right? Like that is just a definite term. Like they're not willing to, they're not unwilling to, they have none at all, right? So notice that word choice. And also too here, this idea of human rights standard. We're not talking about women's rights. We're not talking about safety rights. We're not talking about workplace protections. Human rights. So they really put this in that context. Paragraph 11. Investing in the underlying infrastructure that translates paper codes of conduct into actual practice is key to any meaningful effort. Brands should take steps toward that goal. In other words, you can't just have a piece of paper, you have to act. You must act, right? You have to do something to make these things happen. Having a paper and a policy isn't going to be enough. First, they should publish information about the factories that supply their products, which makes it easier for workers to find out which brands buy from that factory and whom to contact when problems occur. Many apparel companies have been leaders in transparency, but many others have yet to follow good industry practices for making details about their businesses easily available. You know, this idea of publishing, right? Like you think about all the different things that we have where people know, right? Like you go on to the booking websites or the county jails where you see who was arrested. You see different offender lists, right? We put those things out there. We name and shame in a way, right? So we make it public knowledge. Paragraph 13. Second, brands should recognize the limits of social and labor compliance checks, known as social audits in industry parlance, in the language of the industry, in which it may not be possible to address issues like harassment effectively. Monitors are expected to document evidence or sufficiently corroborate complaints they get from workers before they can report it. Studies by CARE and other organizations show how often workers themselves underreport and sometimes do not even recognize harassment. So again, we talk about questions that we might have, like what is this, right? So we probably need to know this organization. And then, you know, this idea of underreporting or not recognizing harassment. So maybe these factories have these policies and have all these things, but they don't really teach, you know, the workers what is harassment and what they should be concerned with, right? So again, we have these kinds of questions that probably need to be addressed. Paragraph 14. Third, merely having monitors check periodically whether or not a workplace has a compliance system is not good enough. The absence of well-trained, independent, and gender-sensitive committees to look into complaints, coupled with a lack of strong anti-retaliation procedures, risk stripping these systems of any credibility. In numerous cases from South Asia, I have found that women workers who dared to speak up had experienced retaliation. So in other words, they don't act because they're scared. Right? And we've already seen that in this text where the factories use that kind of leverage against them, right? So if we don't have, according to this article, if we don't have these processes in place, then these things cannot happen. Paragraph 15, that included factory management not allowing the complainant to work, suddenly finding fault with her productivity and quality of work, or warning that she was a troublemaker. You know, this is an interesting piece right here. When we talk about quality of work, so in a lot of these kinds of, I don't want to necessarily say sweatshops, but in a lot of these factories where they're really abusing the workers, right? So they might use something like piecework pay. And piecework pay is where you get paid based on the number of successfully completed pieces of clothing, right? Like you have this shirt to sew, and somebody comes by and says, "Oh, this isn't good enough," or "There's an error here," or "We need to, we can't sell this piece." That piece that they put together, they don't get paid for, right? And so a lot of times, you see these kind of tricks, if you will, used against people, not only to punish them for these, reporting harassment, but also to really control the pay and to keep costs down and to force people to continue working over and over and over and more to try to keep up. Paragraph 16. Another problem that often brands do their own training and monitoring. In fact, it may be more effective for multiple brands buying garments from the same factory to pool their resources to create a single comprehensive and effective system for that factory. Again, you create a system in which there's a critical mass and more people get involved and more people are watching. Paragraph 17. They could ensure that there are effective and accessible grievance redress systems for workers if their problems are not resolved at the factory level, that they have another path, right? That there's an alternative. Right? There's an alternative for this. Instead of requiring workers to find and use a different complaints procedure for each brand, which is time-consuming, difficult for workers, there should be a simple and effective process for them to lodge complaints, period. And the process should result in clear outcomes when problems are found. Without effective grievance redress that leads to binding outcomes, brands should know that their talk of protecting workers' rights is pure rhetoric. Pure rhetoric. Talk only, right? Like you can talk the game, right? You can talk the game. I'm sorry, that looks bad there. But it's only talk, right? All you're doing is saying the right words, but you're not acting on the right words. Paragraph 18. In late May and early June, governments, employers, and workers' organizations concluded the first round of negotiations for a binding International Labor Organization standard to address violence and harassment in the workplace, supplemented by a non-binding recommendation. Another round of discussions will follow next year. So binding means that they must follow, right? They must do this. Non-binding is just a recommendation. Like, here's the thing you could do, right? Binding, you are bound to do it. You are forced to do it. You are required to do it. Apparel and footwear companies should call on employers, organizations, and governments to unequivocally support a binding standard in next year's negotiations. That would be a major step toward helping make the world a safer place for women. So in the end, what we have here, this piece, this is the call for action right here, okay? This is what the author is calling for. So in the end, what we can say is that this is a persuasive or an argumentative, right? In which she is saying, here's a thing that needs to be done, here's why it needs to be done, and here's how we can do it.